Oh, oh yeah, that email is out of date because function referencing actually is proper RFC now.
Oh, well, we can discuss that. Good time.
Yeah,
There's another.
Levi has. You have a return type hinting, and I think
Yeah,
nullable is also yours.
correct.
If we mention scalar type hinting, we ought to mention those as well, because it's just part of PHP catching up to. I mean, Hack has things in it which PHP ought to have had 10 years ago.
All right, well, we'll get into it. Just open discussion. Feel free to cut Phil off whenever he rambles. We also do a hand signal thing. So if you want to talk next, sometimes there can be a lag and it's kind of hard to tell. Just raise a hand. If you want whoever's talking to shut up because they're rambling, raise two hands. That one's going to be Phil. All right, here we go. I'm going to do the intro. Hey, welcome to episode 30 of the PHP Town Hall. You have myself, Ben Edmonds, here along with Phil Sturgeon, as always. And this week we're joined by Andrea Folds and Levi Morrison. Andrea, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, if you look at my Twitter profile, it says, I'm the fiendish mind who removed PHP's best loved feature, logo GUIDs, in PHP 5.5, and that's pretty accurate. It's also, it's not really important, but there's a backslash before that apostrophe in that, and that is not an intentional subtle jab at PHP. That is a result of PHP's profiles bit on the official website being poorly written. Yeah,
Right.
I've
That
written
explains
a few
everything
RFCs.
about Andrea there. So, where do you live, Andrea? And
I
you know,
currently live near Aberdeen in Scotland, and given some personal events today, I will probably continue living near Aberdeen or even in Aberdeen in Scotland. But my accent to anyone who's from the UK probably betrays that I haven't lived in Scotland for very long.
cool. Is that where Elliot Hagen lived? Aberdeen
Hoffin.
sounds familiar. I don't know how to say that name.
Yeah, he was one of the Code Ignited community people, and Elliot Hoyen was near there for a while, but now he's in San Francisco.
Huh.
Aberdeen likes to call itself the oil capital of Europe, but I'm not sure the rest of Europe calls it that. Although it is a fairly accurate description. Like, there's so much oil industry stuff here, and
Cool. All right, Levi, tell us about yourself.
I live in Provo, Utah, and I have been involved with the PHP projects for, I don't know exactly how long, maybe 3-ish, 4-ish years, and primarily I've done the website stuff, so if you hate the new layouts of the website, I'm the person to yell at on Twitter. And
It is horrible. You should
I have some new stuff coming down the pipe too that's like based on Google's material design, so I'm sure everyone who hates Google's material design will hate our website in the coming months.
I hope your email address is not public anywhere. 'Cause that could be bad.
Well, the php.net one is for sure, so
All right, everyone
there
hates
you can
design. Go find that email address.
but yeah, feedback is always good. It's always negative, but I can sort through it to figure out what people really want. So, besides, what people want is not really what they need. So, who cares, right?
I thought that was Apple's mantra, not Google's. It's not.
I guess relevant to this as well, I have 2 RFCs out there, and worked on those and fixed bugs here and there is about all I've done on PHP Core. Aside from that, so
Cool.
that's me.
Nice, that's more than me. I fixed 3 documentation bugs, and now I have voting karma.
You-
I felt really bad because I got karma like sometime in 2013, but I never felt I deserved it because I fixed 3 bugs, sort of 2, in PHP, and I've removed a vitally important feature. So I mean, I don't deserve karma at all, but I have it.
Nice. I made a pull request onto the PHP source, which if you used a goto, then it would embed the XKCD Raptor attack comic. So I feel like I've done some useful things on the core.
I'm assuming that was not accepted.
No. It's fun though. Yeah, so which RFC do we want to start blathering about first? Because you guys have got loads of really interesting RFCs on the go at the minute. I swear you're rewriting half of PHP. Let's go. I'm going to pick one at random.
Well, let's go in order, because that will be easier once we get drunk. How
okay.
about big ints first?
Okay, so big ints was... There are some things that I add to PHP because they're immediately useful, and there are some things that I think, why on earth don't we have this? And big ints was more of the latter. I mean, someone bugged me on IRC to fix a bug. Well, they said, why don't you do something useful like fixing bugs, and pointed me at a random bug. And it was the one where, you know how the maximum integer and the minimum integer aren't the same? Like the maximum integer is something 7 and the minimum is something 8. So if you subtract the minimum integer, it can't actually fit in an integer. If you flip the sign, it will actually convert into a float, and it was about that bug. And that got me thinking, wait, why do we even have a fixed size integer anyway? Because there are some other dynamic languages, most notably Python, which don't have you don't have a fixed size integer type. It's not 32 bits, it's not 64 bits. You can type in an arbitrarily large number and it will work. And so I set about implementing that, and that's basically what it does. It means that if along with adding arbitrarily large integers, I didn't write the code behind that. I used a library written by much smarter people than me, but I obviously have to write all the stuff on top of it, and that's a lot. The main advantage of that is that if that gets in, and if I finally finish that patch, you'll never have to worry about integers turning into floats magically again. And it means a lot of integer operations make more sense now, because it used to be that you could do stupid stuff like do a bit shift with a negative integer, which does not do what you think it does, and does a completely different thing on Intel processors. It gets rid of that, and basically it's really boring, really. It's boring and it won't affect most people, but when you have it, you'll be glad, because, you know, integers will consistently work, in particular across platforms. Even if you're on a 32-bit machine, any size of integer will work, and that's basically it. It's really boring.
Wow. No, that just means more things will magically work, and there will be less problems, I guess.
It's also more... sorry for interrupting you. The other thing about it is it's more intuitive. It does what you expect. If you put in some large number and add another large number, it stays as an integer. You know. Sorry, you can continue.
No, I was just going to say, is this one? A lot of the RFCs that we're talking about today are taking care of PHP sadness entries. I was just wondering if this is one that they've managed to notice. Are we?
I don't think so, because basically very few languages do the right thing with integers. It put us into the elite group of languages which handle integers properly. We're one of a very few languages that actually implement the division operator correctly. And I come on to this later with integer division, but the division operator in most languages does different things depending on whether you give it an integer or a float. In PHP, it does the right thing. If you do 1/3, it will not give you 0. It will give you a third, like you expect. And that's what Python does. It's what every sane language does. But unfortunately, there aren't very many sane languages. And arbitrarily large integers are a thing like this. Most languages have fixed language integers, and most languages integers overflow, and that's terrible. PHP does something slightly saner, but it's not really a PHP sadness thing. It's a sort of a more novel addition that makes integers just do what people expect, which they don't in almost all languages.
Sweet. I don't really have anything much to add to that, because it sounds like shit's just getting magically better. So that's
I can provide arguments against that, actually. So I work in the
Right.
high performance computing field, so I work with computational research all the time. And so some people in the internals group particularly like care about performance like it's just the
It,
babiest of babies. So I haven't measured the particular impact of this one or seen anyone do such a thing yet, but the idea that you're going to have to detect overflow and do something different could theoretically
well,
slow things down.
the fun thing is that PHP already, as I've mentioned, does the right thing with most integer operations, and this means that unfortunately, I can't test this. The code in the way is currently written to make it easy to debug, not easy for performance. For example, none of the functions are currently inlined, mostly to save me having to type make clean every single time I change something, right? But once I make the necessary performance changes, basically it should have zero impact on existing performance because we already do overflow checks on every single integer operation. At the moment, it's set to be part. It's probably going to be part of the language specification that we do overflow checks, and so all it means is that in the existing overflow cases, instead of overflowing to a float, we'll create this big int type, which so far as userland cares doesn't exist, but internally it's a different type. So far as I know, it shouldn't actually have any impact at all on performance. That remains to be seen. I'll have to do, at some point, I'll have to optimize it a bit and do some benchmarks. But it really shouldn't have any impact on performance at all, considering that all the checks, it doesn't actually add any new checks at all.
It's just taking a different path when you overflow.
Yeah, basically.
So is it completely transparent to userland?
Yes.
Or would it be a separate type that you would need to account for?
Yeah, basically internally it's a separate type. So currently internally, for some reason we have different names internally as we do to the outside world. We call things int in userland and float, but internally it's long and double because of the C types. And this adds a new internal one, is big int. And that type is actually implemented completely differently from your integer type. It's reference counted. It's immutable. It works very much like a string rather than something primitive that's actually copied around. But so far as userland cares, you can't really tell the difference at all. In some cases, your integer will magically become a big int without you knowing, but it will behave exactly the same. The only places where it behaves differently are if you pass it to a function which doesn't support large integers, in which case I'm not currently sure exactly what to do, but there'll be some sort of error. But this is exactly the same thing as you'd get in other languages which don't support, which support large integers, because most functions don't need to accept any size of integer. For most functions, it's okay just to accept 32 or 64 bits. Nobody needs ridiculously large array lengths because you don't have enough memory to represent such a large array in the first place, for example. But basically, no, so far as userland cares, you can't tell the difference at all. It doesn't even... You can, in fact, for the most part, I've tried to hide it from userland. If you look at the type, it just says integer, whatever type it is internally. Certain debugging functions that we use for debugging the Zend engine itself, like debug zval dump, which is a userland function, that will tell you that it's different, but most things, for almost everything, they're equivalent. You can't tell the difference. And that's the beauty of it, really. Technically, beyond a certain point, it's not the same type. But so far as you care, it actually is the same type. It acts exactly the same for almost all functions. It will behave exactly the same, and that's the beauty of it, really.
Nice.
So I just want to clear up something for anyone that doesn't know. When we say internal versus userland, internal means the C code that the core developers are working
You're
in.
cutting out a bit. Were you saying? Are you asking what internals means versus what userland means?
No, I'm trying to explain it for anyone watching that might not know.
Oh, right. I couldn't hear what you cut out for me. I don't know if other people said, but I'd say userland is, I mean, it technically userland in technology means something completely different, but at least in the context of PHP, userland is any function you can write yourself. And internal functions does not actually refer to stuff that's only used to implement PHP. It refers to any standard function like strlen or array map or any of these things, or anything that an extension has. Any function from an extension or class is considered internal. And while it looks the same as any function you write, because it's all written in C code underneath, there are actually some differences between internal and userland functions, and that's why we need to make this distinction sometimes.
So moving on to the next bit, because we're time's cracking on. Scalar type hinting. This is another RFC kind of championed by you recently, Andrea, but it was originally by Anthony Ferreira and a bunch of other people. Can you give us a little bit of a history and what scalar type hinting is?
Basically, ever since PHP added type hints, if you declare a method on a class or a function, you can say, I want this thing to be a specific object, or I want it to be an array, or I want it to be a callable. Ever since we've added those, people have complained about the fact that we only support objects, callables, and arrays. We have never had support for int, string, float, resource, bool, and yeah, that's it. We don't have any of the so-called scalar types. Although resource is technically sort of a scalar, not a scalar, but nobody cares about resource. Forget about resource. But basically, there isn't a type hint for any of these types. And so there have been historically two camps. I mean, there are a bunch of approaches, but the main two ones are: do we have it act? Do we have it cast? So it'll act vaguely like what an internal function does. You can take an internal function that takes an integer and pass in a string or a float, and almost all of the time it will try to convert it to an integer and it will accept it. It won't complain. The other camp has been, do we do it strict? So if it's not an integer, it's not accepted, the program errors. And to be honest, I don't like either of these approaches, because while it's traditional in other languages, PHP is always switched between types, and it's also PHP changes types a lot. An example is, if you add two integers, it might end up a float, and you don't want your program to go bang when you pass it something expecting an integer. So what Anthony proposed was something of a compromise, where it will accept other types, but it only accepts a subset. So it allows some conversions, but only if it really makes sense. And I wanted to take this up actually last year, but I think I wanted to take this up 2 years ago when Anthony withdrew it, but I never got around to it, and I finally got around to it this year and thought, I'm going to put this through. And after a lot of debate, basically the RFC, while I haven't really publicly said as much, the thing is basically dead now, because I don't think it's going to pass. The thing's too inconsistent. I'm not really happy with it either. The problem is that it's trying to strike a compromise that will please both groups, and really it doesn't please either at all. And that's the problem. It's a bit of a mess.
Yeah, I noticed there were a lot of problems with, reading through the internals conversations and watching them happen in real time. Basically, as you said, half of them would want PHP to kind of cast it and turn it into whatever you've recommended, and then the other half want it to be very strict and not do anything. So you have the situation where the really strict ones are just going to have way too much errors to deal with, and you're going to have to try and wrap everything with exception catching and whatever else. And the other group, we're basically casting it. I feel like kind of nullifies the use of it. So if you say this argument has to be an integer and you pass it a string, then it turns it into a 0, then who the fuck? That's not very helpful. So the way that you've ended up going, where a lot of people wanted this sort of compromise. And what happens if you require an integer, but you give it a string, which is a numeric string, and it's just like 42? Okay, well, that should be an integer. But what if you put a space in front of the 42 inside the string? Well, that's also probably okay. What about if you put a space afterwards? No, not if you put a space in afterwards.
Yeah,
it's a pretty weird situation.
The problem is that PHP's conversion semantics as they stand are really, really broken. And it's mostly because, I think partly it's because people, in theory, you're supposed to be able to rely on the conversion semantics, but I think in practice people don't. And because of that, people don't notice how broken the conversion semantics are when they need them. Like, for example, if you have a string that contains a hexadecimal number, it is sometimes a valid integer and sometimes isn't. It's not even consistent across operators. It will work with the at plus operator, but not with the modulo operator, for example. Sometimes it's 0, sometimes it's 11. It's weird. But yeah, the problem is that the RFC tries to strike a compromise. The problem is that nobody's quite sure, not even myself, where you'd strike that compromise. The one thing I would say, though, is that casting doesn't remove all the benefits of type hinting, because you do know once the cast has happened that what you've got is definitely an integer, no matter what was passed in. And that would be particularly important if in future we add some more, for example, something that had been proposed in the past was having methods on scalar types. And in that case, it would be very important to ensure that you actually have an integer. Because if someone passes in a string, you try to use a method that's on integer, it's not going to work. But I'm not going to talk about that, at least at the moment.
Yeah, that's a whole other barrel of fish. But Levi, what do you reckon about this stuff?
So it's interesting. I didn't pick up the scalar type hints either because I figure if it's ever going to be accepted, it won't be what I want, and that's absolute strict type hints. And I use PHP differently than most users do, so I'm not too surprised that most people don't fit that camp. But the other reason I didn't pick it up is that you're going to have to cast to compromise, I feel like, in some way. And like was mentioned, I feel they're just intrinsically broken, and every time someone brings up scalar type hints on IRC or chat room, I'm like, no, don't push for it, we got to fix these conversions first. So
yeah, that's basically the current plan, really. That RFC is basically dead. I believe, I'll actually have to check this, but I believe if you look at it, I can't find the RFC at the moment. I believe if you look at it at the moment, anyone who's paying attention may have noticed that the minimum time needed before you can start a vote has passed, and I haven't put that RFC to a vote, and that tells you that basically I'm holding off. The plan at the moment is basically I'm probably going to drop that, and then at some point try and reform PHP's semantic casting slightly for PHP 7, and then hopefully add it then and have it do what internal functions do, like any of the standard functions, any of your extension functions, because internally we have this function called Zend pass parameters, and if you read the discussion on internals, it comes up a lot, and it has literally every function that you use in an extension or whatever uses that function in the C code to pass its arguments, and it does a lot of casting. It doesn't allow some things, but it does a lot of casting, and I think whatever it's going to be, ultimately it's got to be consistent with what internal functions do, because we can't really have these two types of functions, userland functions and internal functions, which work exactly the same until you pass a string to it. And a userland function, if you pass a string and we had strict type hints, it will blow up. An internal function, if you pass a string, it's just fine. And to be honest, I'm not really sure what to do. The hope is that maybe we can get in something that's based on what the internal functions do, but I don't really know at this point.
Yeah, I totally stayed away from it with my return type RFC because of all of these issues. People kept asking me, why don't you add scalar type hints to it? I'm like, I don't want to touch that at all. I'm not nowhere close. So I guess we could transition into talking more about that RFC.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
There's not a whole lot to talk about other than you have the ability to optionally declare a return type from a function, and it follows covariant return type hinting. For everyone who doesn't know what that means, that's okay. It does what you think it does.
Literally none of us know what that means. Apart from you.
I don't even know, but then I'm not a language designer.
Basically means if it differs from return. I guess it differs from parameter type hints. So if you have a parameter type hint and you try and in a subclass you try and restrict it to that type to a different, more restrictive type, like a child, it fails and won't let you. But on return types, it will let you. So if you say, hey, I declare or I return some type of collection, and then and in a subclass you say I return a list, and a list is a subtype of collection, it will allow you to do that on a return type, but not a parameter. So that actually works out really well when you're working out inheritance rules. It may seem odd at first, but it's what you want. I guess the other controversial thing is that the return type is not declared before the function name. So everyone in C world and friends, I guess, declares it before the name of the function. But we don't do that. We put it after the parameter list. So you just do a parameter list and then a colon and then the return type. And that matches, that's what HHVM hack did in theirs, and it's a really sensible solution. We're not actually mimicking them. We do differ in a few small areas, but syntactically we're the same because it was a really good choice for various reasons.
Yeah, the syntax choice is the same one that TypeScript and ActionScript use, and ActionScript is horrible. So on the one hand, I hate it for that reason, but TypeScript is wonderful. So on the other hand, I really like this.
It's conflicting. So was there much backwards and forwards with the hack team on getting that done? Did they help with any of it, or was it just purely you liked the fact that they did it that way and thought, hey, yep, we can do that too?
So return types is something I've wanted to do for a while. I figured it was a feature of PHP that could be added easily, and if done carefully, it could make it. There have been 4 RFCs already that include return type hints that have been withdrawn or failed. Like, everybody wants them, they weren't good RFCs, you know?
Yeah, well, I remember reading about those, and you on your RFC basically listed all the reasons in which yours was better, and I forgot to look it up. But how did the other ones fail, and how did you overcome their failures?
The number one failure was trying to do something that would break backwards compatibility, or they would add something else to the type system at the same time. So a lot of the past ones mixed in scalar type hints with their RFC for return types, like it all in one package. And as we've seen from scalar type hints, that just keeps failing, right? So by combining it with that, you just lose when you do return types. So and then I don't add any keywords. That's another thing that is interesting. I don't even add void, which is like the lowest hanging fruit. You know, so like I feel like there'd be very little resistance there, but I didn't even touch it because I don't want to.
I kind of want to add void at some point, like after that passes, because one of the things that I really like with adding more type hints is not so much that it allows you to ensure your code is correct, that's important, but also that it's better than having stupid doc blocks at the top of all functions. Because the thing is, if you have a type hinting syntax built in, it means even if the void type hint is useless, and it would be mostly, all it'd be doing is checking that you're returning null, and nobody actually needs that to be done, because if you're returning null, it doesn't matter if you actually return something else, because nobody relies on it being null, right?
We can actually do better. Internally, you can actually check that it returned something at all. So like in userland, if you don't return anything, it's null, or you can return something that evaluates to null. Same
Oh,
thing.
right, yes.
But internally, you can actually check. So when a function is compiled, you can say, hey, you said it was void and you returned something at all.
Yeah, isn't
Um,
it like different if you return null explicitly from just returning?
yeah, internally there is a difference. In userland, there is none.
So
Yeah.
what do you get if you just return? Is it a void?
When you run it at runtime, if you try and use the return value in any way, it's a null with no error.
Okay.
It's just implicitly a null. But internally, you can check that something was actually returned.
Okay.
And this is actually one of the reasons that I didn't include void, is that some people might want you to allow returning expressions that evaluate to void or some other or null, and I just didn't want to deal with it. It's just anything else beyond the scope of adding a return type increases the chances that somebody on internals doesn't like it and
Yeah,
wants to know. So I just stay away as far as possible.
as simple as possible. It's partly why it's partly why that's the plan for scalar type hints. I know it's unlikely, but the plan is basically we want to be, because I discussed with Anthony about this, and basically our plan for now is just if we reintroduce this, we'll write it to be exactly the same as internal functions and do absolutely nothing else. Do the minimal, try and be as inoffensive as possible, because if there's just the slightest thing that will upset someone, things will fail. It's a bit like that property
Yeah.
get set syntax, which I'm not sure if I was able to vote against it at the time, but I would have voted against it because on the one hand it was wonderful adding properties to PHP. On the other hand, nobody liked it because it did way too much, and because of it, PHP still doesn't have properties. But to what I was saying before, I really want more type hints, mostly just because it helps documentation. I want to be able to look at a function signature and know what it does, because C, for all its failings, you can actually look at a function signature and usually know, so long as it's been well written, what it does. In PHP, you know what kind of arguments it takes, usually, unless they're scalars. You don't know what it returns. It's a bit of a mess, really.
Yeah, I look forward to us getting return type hints in there. Even things like the PHP FIG is going to be a lot easier because we're defining interfaces a lot of the time, right? If we're going to define a standard as it relates to code, then the best way to do that is with an interface. And right now we can define the argument types as long as they aren't scalars, and we can define a few other things. But at the end, we end up just writing a doc block and say, please read this and please return an instance of this class, please. And even if the code follows the rules, you don't necessarily know whether it's going to work or not with every implementation. So
yeah, that's a particularly important thing is with interfaces, because ultimately in the end it doesn't really matter how strict our parameter types are for methods and things, but it normally, because it's just validation, you could do that yourself. But with interfaces it's really important because most of the things you want to be able to do in an interface we can't do. You can only specify that in some cases, like if it's an array, if it's a callable, if it's certain types of objects. You can't specify all these other cases. So your interfaces are really weak. You can enforce everything that comes in, but nothing that comes out. It's rubbish.
hang on a sec. Sorry, I just realised that half of us are on mute or missing at the moment.
So has there been any, this is to Phil, has there been any debate in the FIG with maybe addressing this with a doc block format or anything like that in the meantime? Because it's probably going to be years before we get true return types.
Well, the FIG already use doc blocks as in the files, so interfaces and classes that we create are fully doc blocked. The standard that we use for doc blocks is pretty much the PHP doc, PHP documenter format, but there is it's a bit tricky with those formats because there are like 4 or 5 slightly different varying formats for doc blocks. We are working on PSR 5, 6. I'm tired. One of those two is the cache PSR, and that's going to be no. One of those is the PHP doc PSR. So once we've got that, we at least then have a standard for doc blocks, and we can start to use those. But as soon as return types come in, then for a while it's going to be a duplication of information. So we're going to have stuff in the doc block and in the return type, and then in like 5 years' time, people will stop just putting it in the doc block. So it's going to be a bit of annoying waiting for it, but it's good to have it all the same.
Yeah, as far as the waiting for it goes, the reason it hasn't gone to a vote yet is there's a technical issue that we're trying to sort out that deals with opcache. And Joe Watkins has been the go-to guy for that, and as a lot of people are probably aware, he's been busy with his personal life lately, so we haven't got around to fixing that yet.
I was wondering about why it was taking, because from all appearances, things looked like it was done. I mean, the RFC looks done.
Yeah.
So that makes sense.
Yeah, in fact, I have a branch that I run all my code on just to verify that if I add the return types, everything works, and it's all fine until you start adding opcache, and then there's a problem with the early and late binding for various things. So,
which version of PHP are you aiming the return type stuff to get into?
Return types can go into the next major or minor version, either one. So whatever comes first. I think the RFC officially says 5.7 or 6. Hasn't been updated to say 7.
Ah, yeah. I realized.
Actually, let me go back. I promised someone I would say it this way. PHP 7.
Yeah, that's the new thing. have you seen the meme of Dr. Evil? He's different.
But to go away from that topic, because I know that certain people don't want to talk about it. But to go along with the return type RFCs, the nullable types RFC, and it comes up because currently in the return type RFC, there's no way to say return this type or null. And that's just a huge convention throughout pretty much every language that has pointers of any kind, or objects. You know, it's like Java, for instance. If you have a type, you can always pass null to it. It doesn't have, it doesn't restrict that. And I think that's a mistake, but it's such a big need because of historical code, and I don't want to restrict userland developers to force to write their code in a certain way. So we're going to add optional type hinting or nullable type hinting, which allows you to return some type or null. The good thing about that, though, is it's explicit. You can see that this thing returns or takes a type, or it takes or returns a type that's null. So like you can actually distinguish by looking at it. In other languages such as Java, there's no way unless they've commented one way or the other.
There's also a secondary benefit in that, the real need for nullable types is because at the moment you can make something nullable by saying the default is equal to null for parameters, but you can't do that for return, obviously. Having default returns would be weird. But the other thing is that it's a really tangential benefit, but it also means now that you can actually have a type that is nullable, that you can have something that's nullable or a type or has a default value that isn't null. However, that's only useful if we add scalar type pins, and that's probably not going to happen soon. It was just something I noticed when I was adding, when I changed how bools work in the types in RFC. I realized it means if you have nullables, it means you can have something that's true, false, or null, which is actually not that uncommon. You want it sometimes, but that's completely off topic, really.
Yeah, I think just kind of go back to the properties you mentioned earlier. I personally voted no on that, and I'm hopeful that after we have nullable return types nullable types and return types hints, you can more effectively implement getters and setters. Whether that's true or not, I don't know yet. I haven't played around to fully flesh that out, but I am.
Actually, kind of related to that, something I really want, and I understand, I think you want this as well, is at some point I'd like it to be able to, when you declare a property, to set a type for it. Because I was right, I mean, it's
Yes,
bothered me
exactly.
before, but I was writing, I'm working on this tiny little async library, asynchronous library that uses generators because React PHP has no documentation. Like I wish I could use it, and it's really great, and the people that work on it are really clever, but it has no documentation, and I don't want to use JavaScript again. So I'm working on this async library, and it really bothered me that I can't set the type of the properties on my object, even just the private ones. It's annoying because you can only see the type in the documentation when you look at the constructor. And for some things, you're not actually ever setting the type in the constructor at all. You're setting it somewhere far down. And it'd be great, even if just so that I can understand my own code better, that if we could type properties. The problem, there is a slight problem there, and it's also why we might not get generics ever, is that PHP has references, and references cause problems because references mean you can circumvent type checks. If we add types for, you can add a typed property, right? If we do that, then someone's just going to do foobar equals and sign that property, and then assign it to an integer. And at least the way things are implemented just now, that would completely bypass any type checks, because references don't, the way a reference is done internally, it isn't this is a reference to this property on this object. It's actually a reference to that specific value. It doesn't care what object. It's like in an array. You can reference something in an array. We can't, for example, add types to arrays because references would get around them. We probably can't add types to properties because references would get around them. We probably can't add generics because references would get around them. It's a pain. Maybe we just need to get rid of references because they're the problem, really.
Could you not just track a reference back, though? Or is that not possible at all?
The problem is basically references, as I said, basically references don't work like you think they do.
So it's just a pointer to the value itself?
It's basically, it's basically internally, it's a pointer to the value itself, and values in themselves have no information about where they come from. A value doesn't have an owner. You know, an array can share the same first element as a million different variables, and the array has no idea of this, and variables don't. And references the problem. Now, it might be possible to solve this problem. It probably is. It's just, it makes the easy and straightforward way of doing it not easy and straightforward, because, I mean, we could do it and just have allow references to break it, but that means that you can means you can get around important typing, and that's not good. But yeah.
Quick question here. How are we on time? I'm not sure if this is supposed to, how long this was intended to last.
So technically we have about 20 more minutes because we started late, but we usually go over.
Okay.
Everyone okay on time? Do I have to rush off?
Good.
I'm fine for the moment.
I was just Hulk smashing around my apartment trying to find a pack of cigarettes that I swear to God are around here somewhere, but yeah, I've got a problem.
Yeah, so just to finalize that then, since we have time, with properties, if you define properties as a specific way of defining getters and setters that use return types, if you don't hint them to return references, you could actually solve that by simply saying, well, there are no reference. You can't return a property via reference. Just not possible by signature of the function. This would cause complications if your property you were trying to work with is an array, because array is the most common type you use a reference with. And to get rid of references, which is something I would personally love for various reasons, means you have to change array semantics, and I think that will be a game breaker. I don't think we can do that. I wish we could.
That's true.
I wish we could change array semantics, but I don't know if we could at this point. Just the backwards compatibility issue would be huge on that one.
Actually, one thing, the thing is, references are widely used. Part of the problem could be solved if instead of having references, we allow having out parameters. Because basically we use references for out parameters. You know, like how in C Sharp, and I mean C does the same thing with pointers, but in C Sharp and things like it, you have out parameters where you can say this is a parameter, and if you put a value, if you pass a value there, it doesn't actually pass the value. Instead, the output of that function goes to the variable you pass in as an argument. If we added those that means that all the array functions which currently take a reference could just use that instead. But there's still a lot of problems with references because people still use them a lot with arrays. But it would solve the main case. Still, it's the dream, but I don't think removing references is really going to happen.
All right, we should probably go to the next topic. What do we have next? The closure call RFC.
Yeah, this was another of those things where I thought, why don't we have this? It's not really meant to be some momentous feature. It will benefit some people. On Twitter, Daniel Lowry told me that it helps performance in his app, and that's good. The main reason I added it was because it was because of function referencing. I was fiddling around with closures, and I wondered why you have to bind things explicitly and return a new closure. Why can't you just bind a new object? When you can basically, at the moment with closures, you can bind an object to them, and that means that when you call it, this will be set to this variable will be set to some specific object. And I wondered why can't you set that call time? Because in some cases you need to bind. In some cases, you need to bind a closure a lot of times and call it. And it'd be far more efficient if you could just do that at call time. And in some applications, this is useful. And in particular, it's useful with my function referencing RFC. And that's basically how it came about. I thought, why don't we have this? It's a really basic thing. It's really simple to implement. And it will benefit some. And really, I just hope it's uncontroversial. Maybe it will be opposed. I just don't. It's just a basic thing that I wondered why we don't have it already. So why not add it? Because when people need it, this will be useful. Most of the time, you're not going to need it because most people aren't doing fancy things with closures. But when you are, it's handy. There's not really that much to say about it.
I figure, yeah, it's a nice little feature. So we'll put a link to it in the show notes, and people can have a look at more of it. I figured we've got like 10-15 minutes left, so it might be quite nice to talk about how you guys got involved with contributing to PHP internals and the website. Levi, would you like to take that away?
Sure. So I don't even remember why, but I wanted Doc Karma, and Salath. I don't know how to say it. Sorry if I slaughtered your Nicola, but he mentioned that if I requested an account and mentioned that I like kittens, that I would almost certainly get an account for Doc Karma. And I did, and I got the Karma. And since I had it, and had also mentioned that I like to do some stuff on the website, I just started hacking on it. You know, there was this huge, at the time, the prototype.php.net had been around since, I don't know, 2009 or something, and I was like, why don't we have this? Our website looks like it was straight out of the 90s, and it probably is, and was at the time, and so I started working on that, and that's how I got involved with the PHP projects to begin with, and I started working with, you know, the various things in the bug tracker, and just found a few bugs. I thought, you know, I could probably fix that, and so I started getting involved in internals that way and voting on things, and I became kind of like the main pusher for the website relaunch that happened last year. So it's kind of, I just kind of took over the website somehow. I don't really quite know how I got it, to be honest, but at this point I basically do whatever I want, for better or worse, such as putting the function, the related functions on the right side of the screen. Some people feel very strongly and passionately about putting them back on the left, And to be honest, I probably will. I just haven't had the time to just go in and redo that. So
The vast majority of the PHP community needs to calm the shit down. People freak out about stuff, and it just doesn't matter. But no, fair enough. I'm assuming that it's because you've got a lot of C developers, and then a website, and those two things are kind of different. It's like, oh Christ, I've got to do CSS. But do I use position relative or float? Back to my pointers.
This is going to be a controversial statement, but some people who don't like PHP very much, definitely not me, might say that it's because you've got a lot of PHP developers trying to make a website, and that's how you ended up with something that's bad. I mean, to be honest, the website reflects the language in many respects. I mean, it reminds me of PHP Info, the old website does. It even has the same color scheme.
How many PHP developers does it take to make a decent-looking website? I don't know. I'll tell you when it happens.
You see, I don't know about you guys. One of my favorite pastimes is to look at the websites that various people respond with their email addresses on the list, and every time I'm greeted with a really horrific, absolutely horrific website. I should probably be keeping a list because some of them are just amazing.
Actually, to be honest, I think the answer to that, Phil, is probably something more along the lines of 1 to write the website and 23 to moan about how it breaks backwards compatibility. And then 2 more people to also try to write the website a few years later. And then another person who eventually succeeds.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a funny one. I guess you guys have the same problem as we have in the Fig, where everyone likes to come up with an alternative proposal instead of actually contributing to the main one. So then you've got 10 different versions of something that's half finished. Anyway, crap. So the thing that we forgot to talk about is the specification for PHP that's being.
Oh yes, that.
I can't believe
Kind of
you
a big deal.
failed on that one. That was the main point of this talk. So for everybody else that's not been paying attention to Reddit or anywhere else. Facebook have been coming up with a specification for the language, which will be based around PHP 5.6, and they're writing it for HHVM and Hack and everything else, so that all of these different versions of the implementations can conform to some sort of specification. So we haven't just got 20 different random implementations that may or may not work together, right?
The real joy behind the specification, if this, globally accepted or work towards, is that you can then write a unit test against a spec, and then you can make your own engine as long as it passes those tests. Your spec's good or your engine's good. So it really opens the door to other engines without a bunch of people complaining that it's totally different and it's going to break my app, and you can be like, no man, it matches the spec, and that should shut up the haters, basically.
Yeah, it also has the advantage that basically it will make, even if these other implementations didn't exist, having a spec makes the PHP.NET PHP, the PHP everyone just calls PHP, that implementation, it will make that work better, because basically currently we're implementation defined, which is sort of a nonsense really, because you can't really define it with an implementation, because people will acknowledge when the implementation is wrong, even though there's only one. The problem is that basically, if PHP at the moment, if the main implementation has a bug in it, that is part of the language. You can, if you implemented something wrong 5 years ago in the internals of PHP, that is now a feature of the language, for better or for worse. With a specification, it means you can write actually in English and specify clearly and formally what's supposed to happen. And that means that if PHP.NET does the wrong thing, at least the wrong thing according to the specification, we can actually say it's wrong and correct it, and that's generally good. It's part of. It's a nice thing because we finally have this. It means it's taken a while, but it's going to happen, and that's good. It's a bit like Nikita's abstract syntax tree RFC, or the which, so far as so far as people who aren't internals have to care, you don't need to worry about it because it's purely an implementation detail, but it does mean that PHP is more regular and more formal, does more what you expect, and that's good, and that's really the benefit of the specification. We can say what PHP does, and then PHP will actually have to do it, rather than what PHP does is what PHP does.
So one question on that, or I guess concern raised, is this just mean that changes now are going to have to go through a two-step approval process instead of one? So who's going to, I guess, officially manage the spec? Will it be Facebook? Will it be an open source effort? And how will changes of that be propagated to the various engines?
It was originally thought, I mean, some people wanted to have an independent spec committee, but I don't think really anyone actually wants that, because there are only two implementations that really matter at all: PHP and HHVM. And HHVM, even then, not that many people use it. Facebook do, and some really large enterprises do. Wikipedia uses HHVM now, but really not that many people use it even. PHP is still dominated by the original implementation. So basically, the decision so far has been, actually, no, we'll just keep with the standard RFC process, and what will probably happen is just future RFCs will have not just a patch for the implementation, but they'll also add to the specification itself. As for versioning, I'm not sure how it's going to work. Probably what's going to happen is that it'll keep, the original implementation is probably just going to keep being version numbered the same, and HHVM is probably going to keep doing its own thing. But now HHVM will be able to say fully PHP 5.7 compliant, at least according to the specification, and that's a good thing.
Yes,
so the spec would still be managed by internals in that case?
It'll be managed, to be honest. It has more, at least at the moment, it has more outside involvement than PHP generally does. Like, there are more Facebook people working on it, and that's good. But it would seem it's mostly the same people, because, to be honest, most of the people working on PHP are working on the PHP implementation. There are a few people from Facebook, but most of the work on PHP is from the original PHP.
But if you look at the announcement, Sarah Goldman's obviously involved in both the internals team and the HHVM team, and we actually were talking about the potential chance of a spec back in episode 19 somewhere, wherever it was. So it's pretty cool that she's involved with both projects, because it makes her a perfect person to head up, to kind of lead the specification. Can't think of words. I'm so tired today. Yeah, she's leading the project essentially, and she's a good person to do it because she is on both the teams. And there have been a few people helping out from internals that are, helping the HHVM side of things, and Nikita and I think Stas is in there as well. So it's a fairly cross-group effort, which I'm impressed with. I assumed that Facebook would end up doing this great thing, and then Zend would shout them down and tell them to go away, and then we'd have this awesome thing that no one gets to use, because recently we've not been allowed to have nice things, and this is one of the nicest things that PHP can expect within the next couple of years, I think.
Yeah, just to fill in, a lot of the Facebook people have actually gotten PHP.net accounts recently. Well, not the Facebook people, but HHVM people, and we're starting to, I believe there is actually a Git repository already for the spec. I'm checking that right now.
Yeah, there is, and I'll find it and put a link in notes. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's already, Sarah has said, I don't know if she said it publicly, but at least privately, that, and a few others have said that, the goal is to migrate it predominantly to the PHP, I don't know what to call us collectively, because we're not the PHP group technically. If you look at the copyright PHP group, we're not those people. But
I like PHP.net. I mean, everyone has it in their email address, so that works.
That's true. That works. Yeah. So turn over to, it's already in the way to transfer over, and I just was curious. I was wondering how up to date the spec was, and I know of a few issues that Anthony had mentioned, but I just noticed that it doesn't mention static closures at all, which is surprising because that's one of the things that the HHVM people opened a bug report, and it's one that I fixed, and it took a long time to get it approved because nobody knew what the proper behavior was. So I'm surprised that we don't see it in the spec already.
The thing that the spec actually needs a lot of work. It's gonna take quite a while before that's really ready. Once it's done, it'll be mostly done. I mean, because that was something I noticed as well. I noticed the closures thing. The closures thing was really weird because the PHP manual, believe it or not, is pretty precise on this. The PHP manual was more precise than the specification. Despite what you'd expect on closures, and I've submitted a patch to fix that, and it's gone in now. There's a lot of things that still need fixing. A lot of things. It doesn't describe how variables and classes work properly. It doesn't do it correctly anyway, but we'll get there, and that's great.
Yeah, I mean they're on version 1 now, which is you would have thought that would be a done version, but I think it's just like the initial one. They're just going to keep on.
It's like the first draft. It still says draft in the repo. I think actually it is for the moment still the draft. It's not official. It's official, but it's the official draft. It's nowhere near done really.
Basically, instead of starting at 0.1, they just started at 1.
Yeah, fair enough. That works. Have you seen any pushback to it so far? I recently quit. Well, I started just piping all of my internals mail into my trash. I don't really want to talk about
Why would you do that? I don't understand why you would feel that way.
Well, it's because it's your guys' fault, you two. Because you've come up with so many good RFCs recently between the pair of you. That there's just been a lot of chatter, and most of it's pretty cool, but there has been just some shit.
You said good. I would say good is subjective. There are some RFCs which I submit and later vote against when they come to a vote.
Nice.
There hasn't. I don't think anyone's really opposed it because I think everyone realizes that PHP needed to do it. It was just something difficult and it requires a lot of effort. So until someone did it, and now someone's done it, it wasn't going to happen just because it's so much effort to document it. But now it's happened, it's going to happen. Nobody's really opposed to it. There'll be some debate though over what the correct behavior is in some places, because in some places, arguably, all the implementations there are actually do the wrong thing. But should we fix this now, or should we put the wrong thing in the spec and fix it next version? One example is, for example, you can have 2 default sections in a switch at the moment in both PHP and HHVM. It's not an error. What do we put in the spec? It will only use one of them, and HHVM uses a different one than PHP, but you can actually do that. So what do? Do we do the right thing in the spec and say you can only have one default clause, because only one of them will be run anyway, it doesn't matter which implementation you use? Or do we say we should document what the current implementations do and fix this in 7? Myself, I think we should just say you can only have one, because I don't think anyone actually relies on having 2 default clauses because it doesn't work properly anyway. But there'll be a bit of debate over that kind of thing, but I haven't seen anyone oppose it at all.
Yeah, I think most of the pushback I've seen was that Facebook handed over this draft, and when they did so, it was kind of it seemed a lot more finalized, the language they used, than they intended, and that was just a communication slip there. They didn't intend it like that at all, but it seemed on release, so that was a big worry. Like, hey, they put all this time to develop this awesome thing entirely behind closed doors, and now it's final and great.
I don't think Zend can get too angry about someone working on something behind closed doors and then just whacking it out on the table and wondering why there's pushback.
Do you, Levi? Do you remember the moral imperative to vote against the 64-bit integer RFC, or was it the? Yeah, I remember there was that whole spat when PHP-NG and the 64-bit RFC came out around about the same time, and they basically obsoleted each other because both patches, you couldn't merge both. They both break each other. And there was this massive spat on internals with Zaev, I think that's how his name is pronounced, was like, you must vote against this for the sake of... I say Zeev, but I know it's not how his name's supposed to be said. Like,
Oh.
but it's like on. There was this massive thing, it's like a moral duty. You must vote against this for the sake of PHP. And then there was another one that's saying, and then there were people on the other side saying, no, Zend have developed PHP and G behind closed doors against the spirit of open source. You should vote against this and vote for the 64-bit. And to be honest, it was all nonsense because the 64-bit RFC was terrible as it stood. It did a lot of wrong things, and they later have changed them. And they were also like doing loads of the PHP and G. It wasn't like it would obsolete PHP and G entirely. It would just delay it, and the internals can get into some ridiculous spats sometimes.
No way.
Yeah, my
I could get us into a whole lot more of them if I chose to. So I'm grateful.
Yeah, I think if we keep this sort of behaviour up, then anyone that gets onto PHP Town Hall will automatically have their voting karma removed. So I should probably stop bickering. But that's been fun. Do you guys have any other topics that you would like to discuss, Ben? Because otherwise we're getting towards the hour there.
Yeah, I think we're done with our list.
I never mentioned how I got into PHP, which
You didn't?
It isn't a terribly long story. If you know Nikita Popov, I'm pretty sure everyone does by this point. He's awesome. He's written some really great RFCs, some of which affect internals only, some of which affect userland, but they're all really great. Everyone loves him, I think. But there's probably someone that hates him because of backwards compatibility. He wrote a blog post in 2012 that showed up on Hacker News on the front page. If you are not aware of what Hacker News is, it's like Reddit, but without most of the problems that Reddit has, and it isn't as misogynistic most of the time. But he wrote this blog post on how you add a feature to PHP. It was really extensive. He added this in operator, which is probably not going to happen, but for the sake of example. And so he showed how you compile PHP, which is literally 2 commands. PHP is really easy to compile yourself. If you haven't done it, try it, even if you don't know C, because you can customize it and install whatever extensions you like, and it's just one file. But he showed how to compile it and then how to edit the lexer so it recognizes the token, how to add it to the parser, how to add the compilation step, how to add the opcode, how to add the actual code that implemented it. And that got me interested in developing PHP, and I got into it then, and I later joined in the year, and this is rather embarrassing. I wrote so many emails, emails in 1.5 months that I very quickly climbed very near the top of the top 100 most emails of all time to internals, and quit soon after. And then I came back 2 years later. It's sometime in 2013, slightly more mature, a lot less spammy. I send at least a quarter of the emails I sent in that time period now. And that's basically just how I got into it. Nikita detailed how you implement a PHP feature, and that got me interested, and I started hacking at PHP. I used PHP before this, although I'm not proud of the PHP code I wrote in 2010. Unfortunately, PHP has a problem that if you go on Google and search PHP tutorial, literally everything you find is absolutely terrible and was written for the 1990s. And I have code that was written just 4 years ago that is absolutely horrible because Google gives you horrible tutorials. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded, but that's how I got into PHP.
That's a pretty cool story, because I feel like that Nikita article was incredibly recent, but I guess 2 years is a while, and it's pretty cool that in that time that was the inspiration for you to get involved and start doing stuff. I mean, that was the article that I read that started me messing around with compiling my own silly versions, and that was when I made my fork that I told you about earlier, where if you try using a goto, it injects the XKCD comic in there saying, why would you use a goto? What's the worst that could happen?
Yeah.
And yeah, it's fun to play around with that stuff and kind of get an understanding of how it works, especially because it means that you can, once you learn how to compile it, you see these new versions come out, and you don't have to be able to write massive new features and and make your own RFCs, if you can download them and play around with them and run unit tests on them, or grab an RC version or grab the NG branch, for example, you can grab that shit and start doing some really cool testing with it. See if your application runs with it. See if you can break it. See if you can, I don't know, contribute in any way apart from writing code.
If you compile PHP yourself, it's really easy to do. Like, you don't need to know any C code because the build scripts are actually really solid and they don't break almost all the time. It's literally just 2 commands if you download the source. And pretty much anyone can do it, even if you've never touched a single line of C code. And the great thing about compiling PHP yourself is you can remove anything you want. You can remove literally almost any extension, and you can. And also, most OSs have really old versions of PHP that are like 1 or 2 years old, which isn't really that old, but when you want to use the new features, it is. You can compile PHP yourself and install it, and now you have the latest version of PHP, and it's great.
Yeah. So I guess the message to wrap this up is that everyone listening to this should go and join internals because it's great and it's really easy to do everything with it. So that's the goodbye message on that. Yeah, thanks for joining us, everybody. It's been a good one. I mean, there are going to be some people out there that don't know half of what we've been talking about, I suppose, because not everyone's too wary of internally stuff, but hopefully we can try and get back to more just drunken shouting at each other for next week's episode.
This has been I think the most common intellectual podcast so far.
Yeah. Well, I've had 3 days in a row of rather active pub life, so I've given myself a nice quiet day for the podcast. And
So yeah, we actually have some really interesting things coming up too for future episodes, such as the abstract syntax tree for PHP is a really big deal. So.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
And no surprise, it comes from Nikita. So.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. Oh, and for everyone listening, last episode we did bicker a little bit about 6 versus 7 and which we thought would win. PHP 7 has won, so the next version of PHP after 5.6 or maybe 5.7 is going to be 7.
I kind of like to apologize to everyone because the RFC and pretty much everything associated with it ended up being an utter shambles, and I made several really bad judgments. The thing is that I'm glad. Well, I think it's over. I think now that vote has passed, it actually passed a 2/3 majority, even though it didn't require one. Hopefully now it's settled, because to be honest, after 3 weeks of arguing about it, I don't care anymore if it's 6 or 7. I just want a name, and I don't want us to argue about it anymore. And I think it's over, and I hope it's over. We can now move on to more important matters. And that was always the point of the thing anyway. People asked, why are we doing stuff when we could be doing more important stuff? The point of it was, I knew if it looked like a release was coming soon, at some point someone was going to bring up the version number issue, so we might as well settle it now, and I think it's settled. Though I know Levi has some thoughts on this, which might differ from mine, perhaps.
I'll let it go for now.
It's a dead horse at this point, right?
Well, so just to summarize what I think about it, I think you summarized it pretty well. That a lot of the process around it was just utter shambles. And I think I'm very ashamed of the fact that we even voted on an RFC that had the language in it. Now, granted, almost certainly few people actually read the content of that RFC, but it was. I think there were, for various reasons, there were just statements and things and biases and things that I think are problematic for future. Like, the behavior is problematic for future of PHP. I really don't care if 6 or 7. I'd prefer 6, but whatever.
I think I like the PHP 8 sophisticated sturgeon proposed and advocated on Twitter. I think everyone can agree that naming it after a fish, and definitely nothing else with the same name, would be universally accepted.
God. Yeah, that was a funny one. Quite a few good suggestions came up for different names, and it was like PHP 1, just the word 1, and all sorts of stuff, silly stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you, Levi, and I know there's a fair few others who feel the same way. Is that none of us really cared too much about the number, but whichever was picked had to be picked for the best, most logical reason, and
Yeah.
not based on bullshit. And the RFC was unfortunately unfairly balanced towards in one direction.
It was a bit of it was really a shambles because it started off being really biased to 6. It didn't even have a 7 option because I assumed we were going to get a 2/3 vote for 6, which was a naive assumption, and it was completely wrong. And later changed it, and I let Zeev add to it. And then what happened was Zeev, after 2 weeks, never actually added his case for 7. So I thought, well, I might as well get it over with. I don't want to discuss this anymore. I'm tired. So I started the vote, and then he added a section. And then what happened was I came back and thought, wait, why did I start the vote? Now there's this massive PHP 7 section, there's this tiny 6 section, and he's removed some paragraphs in PHP 6 unintentionally because they were now covered by the 7 section. And it wasn't fair of me to start the vote anyway when there wasn't a 7 section. And then, so I close the vote and think, we need to fix this before we have another vote. I wake up, I'm tired, I haven't had enough sleep. I look briefly over the 7 section, I think, that looks okay, that's fine enough. Over the 6 section, I think, that looks okay, Zeev's edits that are fine. I start it, and then later realise what I've done. And at this point, everyone's made a complete fuss over the fact that the vote was restarted. I don't want to restart it again, and I didn't want to have another argument, so... I'm not. If there ever is a second vote, which I really hope there isn't, I'm not. I'm not going to touch that with a yard-long pole. That whole discussion.
Yeah, done. Well, what I was referencing with the kind of unfairly stacked sides wasn't so much yours. It was when Zeev put in arguments like PHP 7 is a lucky number in some Western countries. And PHP 6 didn't work out very well for Poe. I'm like, ugh, it's not a thing. You can't just say that. Like, apparently the number 8 is really unlucky in China, so fuck it, let's just go with 9. Like, you can't use bullshit international arguments like that to try and make a reasonable point.
I mean, 7 is a really appealing number. It's a prime number. I like that. But then 6 is even. I'm so conflicted, really, with version numbers.
Well, I think... Yeah, that was a really crappy thing to put in there for an RFC. You know, like, he even admits, like, no, we're not truly seeing it as a real advantage here.
Yeah, the thing with that
was, it's a technical document.
The problem with that actually particularly was, I mean, he had a little jokey 2 bullet points, right, with jokey ones that aren't to be taken seriously, and yeah, it's silly, but he had that section. Most of the stupid, jokey ones were not in that section. They were under the serious arguments one, which is sort of why. But anyhow, the thing is mostly over, I think, I hope. It's PHP 7 now, 6 existed a long time ago, and hopefully we can move on from this and we have a version number.
Well, the next T-shirt from madeinproduction.com is going to have to be a little tombstone with a 6 on it and just say "Never forget."
I like it. You still won't send me one, but I like it.
I was
funny because for so long we wanted to forget 6, and now here we are talking about how nice it would be to have one, right?
If you want to be really even more old-timey, you could just put Unicode on a tombstone, because to people who aren't familiar with the history of PHP, that means nothing. They think, but Unicode isn't dead. Everyone uses Unicode these days. But Unicode in PHP and PHP 6 are the same thing in history. There was that Unicode branch, and it's dead. And some people wish it hadn't died.
A lot of hard work went into it, but it didn't quite work out. So that is sad. So I liked how we were going to end it and then started talking about 6 versus 7.
For like 15 minutes afterwards.
Yes. the title of the last episode was "Let's Not Mention PHP 6 versus 7." Both episodes we've done.
Like at this point, every town hall is going to have 15 minutes bitching about this decision.
So which team were you on in the war? Nice. Right, I'm out of here. Thanks very much for coming on, both of you. And you've been great guests. Hopefully we'll have you back sometime.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks to both of us.
Thanks. It was great.
Later.